It's here. The fastest, the tallest looping coaster on the face of this earth. And if you like this performance, wait till you catch it live. The Great American Scream Machine, only at Six Flags Great Adventure.
In 1989, this was the world's tallest and fastest looping steel roller coaster, the Great American Scream Machine, located at Six Flags Great Adventure. Upon entering the parking lot, Scream Machine was present front and center, completely dominating the park's skyline, as trains roared down the massive drop and into 3 back-to-back vertical loops elevated high in the air. In its opening years, the ride was immensely popular and drew in large crowds who were eager to ride the looping red and white giant. This was critical to Great Adventure, as the 1980s had been horrific for the amusement park. In fact, Great Adventure was nearing the possibility of shutting its doors due to a string of assaults and unfortunate deaths caused by several ride accidents. Families were afraid to visit the park, and many had lost their trust with the place. If Great American Scream Machine never opened, we may have lost Great Adventure decades ago, and many of the park's iconic roller coasters that operate today, like El Toro or Kingda Ka, may have never been built. But while Great American Scream Machine brought in the crowds and helped restore a good image for Great Adventure, the ride itself wasn't the best. In fact, it was quite rough, and you can even say problematic. The ride was introduced toward the end of an era where roller coasters were designed without the aid of computers, and just a few years later, smooth and state-of-the-art roller coasters would begin opening that quickly made Scream Machine obsolete. In this video, we'll take an in-depth look at the problems that arose at Six Flags Great Adventure in the 1980s, how Scream Machine helped correct the bad image the park developed, and then how the roller coaster would later meet its demise. Before we get started, if you guys wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that would be greatly appreciated, as that helps the channel immensely against the YouTube algorithm. Alright, let's dig in. Great Adventure first opened its doors on July 1st of 1974 and was vastly different than what it is today. It was not part of the Six Flags Corporation and thus had no Six Flags branding. It simply went by the name Great Adventure and was led by Warner Leroy, the park's original pioneer. Located in Jackson, New Jersey, the park catered to both the Philadelphia and New York City metropolitan areas. The park's main entrance was in a completely different location than you find it today, at the far left end of Dream Street at the 4 large tents. Some of the park's opening year attractions still operate to this very day, like the Sawmill Log Flume, which opened as the world's longest log ride, the Giant Wheel, which opened as the world's tallest Ferris wheel, and the Runaway Mine Train, the park's headlining roller coaster. Quickly, it became apparent that the park could attract more crowds than it could handle, and the park was quickly expanded. 1975 saw the addition of a fun fair section, which increased the number of rides in the park by 50%. Some of those new rides included a second Ferris wheel called the Panorama Wheel, and a Schwarzkopf Jumbo Jet roller coaster, which oddly never opened. A second log flume was also added called the Moon Flume, which helped absorb the large crowds at the log flume. In addition, many of the park's walkways were widened, more walkways were added wherever there was space, and many restrooms, places to eat, drink, and play games were added to boost capacity. The park's original entrance was completely inadequate to handle the crowd, so it was moved in 1976 nearby the fountain. This more than doubled the capacity of the main entrance and still serves as the park's entrance to this day. Warner Leroy would grow less and less interested with running Great Adventure like a business, and by 1975, his involvement with the park had essentially ended. At the end of 1977, the park was purchased by Six Flags Corporation and officially renamed Six Flags Great Adventure. In 1978, the park would open its first upside-down roller coaster, Lightning Loops, a dueling pair of launch shuttle loop roller coasters built by Aerodynamics. The ride featured the world's first interlocking vertical loops. Vertical loops were the rage of the 1970s and featured an innovative clothoid design, providing riders with a consistent number of G-forces through the entire loop, rather than a circular loop from the early 1900s, which provided dangerous amounts of G-forces at the bottom and not enough G-forces at the top. Later that same season, the park would introduce a new haunted house walkthrough attraction for the park's new Hollow Weekends event. The attraction was set up temporarily, but proved to be immensely popular. So popular that a more permanent version of the ride was introduced in 1979 that also doubled its rider capacity. That same year, the park would simultaneously debut Rolling Thunder, a dual-tracked racing wooden roller coaster that stood as the park's tallest, fastest, and longest roller coaster. Overall, the 1970s were extremely prosperous for Six Flags Great Adventure, as the park grew massively in both size and attendance. But the 1980s would be a different story. The 1980s brought further expansion, but also incidents and accidents that would shake the public's confidence with the park. On August 16, 1981, a 20-year-old employee fell from Rolling Thunder during a test ride and was killed. It was later confirmed that the employee had quote-unquote assumed an unauthorized riding position that did not make use of safety restraints, and the ride was deemed safe to continue operating. Less than 2 weeks later, on August 29th, a woman would unfortunately choke to death while riding Rolling Thunder. It was determined that her death was caused by aspiration of gastric contents, and the medical examiner said, quote unquote, "It's not impossible that she may have had a gastritis or gastric upset before she went on the ride." Later that same year, on December 3rd, while the park was closed for the season, a gaming pavilion and storage building caught fire, causing an estimated $1 million in damage. The park's marketing director said it's a washout. 2.5 years later, in 1984, the park would see its most horrific accident ever. On May 11th at 6:35 p.m., the haunted castle across the moat caught on fire, and flames quickly spread through the building due to the air conditioning system and flammable materials the attraction was built with. About 29 guests were inside the attraction when the fire started, and most managed to escape the burning building. Firefighters from 11 surrounding counties responded, and by 7:45 p.m., the fire was declared under control. Unfortunately, once the fire was put out, it was discovered that 8 teenagers had been trapped inside and lost their lives. Great Adventure and its parent company Six Flags Corporation of Chicago were put on trial for charges of aggravated manslaughter, accused in the indictment of reckless conduct and extreme indifference to human life, and failing to take adequate fire prevention measures. It was found that no fire drills were ever conducted for employees who worked the haunted castle, and that they received no instruction in using fire extinguishers. The ride also had no sprinklers, fire alarms, smoke detectors, windows, or employee communication systems whatsoever. On top of that, there was only one employee working inside the attraction at the time of the fire instead of the normal 5. Overall, it was found that the haunted castle violated up to a dozen state regulations. It was later determined that the scene was started by a 14-year-old boy who accidentally started the fire with a cigarette lighter by brushing its flame against a ripped piece of foam wall pad. The identity of the boy was never confirmed, and he was never charged for the incident. In the end, the jury found Great Adventure and Six Flags Corporation not guilty of charges. Instead, the jury blamed Jackson Township officials who had allowed the haunted castle to slip through cracks in the fire code and operate year after year. Following the fire, the 1984 season would see attendance numbers drop heavily. In 1983, 3.4 million guests visited the park, and by the end of the 1984 season, only 2.7 million attended. In fact, Great Adventure had been rallying over the past few seasons to drive attendance numbers higher, and in 1983, the park was the 4th most attended park in the United States, behind Walt Disney World, Disneyland, and Knott's Berry Farm, which were all open year-round, while Great Adventure was just seasonal. Much of the general public had lost its confidence with the park and refused to visit, especially after seeing the cold response the park had about the Haunted Mansion fire toward families of the victims. Great Adventure would try to rebound for the 1985 season by reassuring guests that the park was a safe, fun, and family place. A brand new state-of-the-art fire protection system was installed at the park. Sprinklers were added to every park structure, along with electronic monitoring systems and a 24-hour central station. A gigantic water tower was also added to provide the necessary pressure for the miles of new sprinkler pipes installed. As far as attractions go, the park also added the Looping Starship, which ran as a more thrilling version of the Buccaneer. Overall, attendance in 1985 would rise slightly and come in at 2.89 million guests. 1986 would see the addition of Ultra Twister, a first-of-its-kind roller coaster in the United States, built by Japanese manufacturer Togo. More kids' rides were also added to the Looney Tunes land to help round out its collection of attractions. Unfortunately, on Easter Sunday of that year, 3 guests were stabbed in 2 separate incidents, including an attempted robbery. This did not help the park's outlook to be a safe, fun, and family place. Overall, the 1986 season saw attendance climb upward, but only to 2.95 million guests. Still not quite the 3+ million guests the park hoped to achieve. 1987 would see the introduction of Splashwater Falls, a modern shoot-the-chutes ride which soaked all riders every time. The season seemed to be starting off well, until yet again on Easter Sunday, 2 guests were stabbed and another was unfortunately shot. On Memorial Day, rough crowds would attend the park again and massive fights broke out, driving families further and further from attending. The park would take precautionary methods by tripling its security team and adding temporary metal detectors at the main entrance. But just when things couldn't get any worse, they did. On June 17, 1987, a 19-year-old teenager named Karen Brown was riding lightning loops and fell 75 feet or 23 meters to her death after not being properly secured by her restraint. From what I understand, the victim boarded the train after it had already been checked by ride employees and sat on top of a closed and locked restraint. The ride crew failed to notice that Karen improperly boarded the ride and dispatched the train, leading to her unfortunate death. To make things worse, I hear that the ride crew were having a water gun fight at the time of the accident, which further distracted them from catching any errors in operation. Then just 1 month later, on July 22nd, 1987, a man broke his leg while boarding the Sarajevo bobsled attraction, after the ride operator accidentally started the attraction while the man was still stepping into the car. Overall, the first half of the 1987 season was an absolute disaster for Great Adventure, and guest confidence in the park's ability to provide a safe visit was reduced to an all-time low. It's my understanding that attendance at the park dropped yet again. In 1987 only pulled 1.9 million visitors, down 37% from 1986. Some internal members of Six Flags Corporation believed the park was jinxed and that it could never regain its credibility. Thankfully, Six Flags acted and put together a team of the best leaders the company had to run Great Adventure. Ray Williams was selected to be the park's new president and had to leave his family and home in Chicago, where Six Flags headquarters were located. Williams was quoted saying, "We're determined to regain public confidence. We are going forward and we're coming back." Ray Williams and his team of 4 vice presidents began making many changes to the park as soon as they arrived in 1987. The park immediately stopped the sale of beer, wine, and wine coolers and only offered them to guests at catered or group events. The park also increased efforts to stop unruly and disruptive behavior from guests. Any fight now brought an immediate police response. The park attempted to attract families back. The damage caused by the spring and summer of 1987 would alter the outlook Six Flags had for Great Adventure. The park already had plans with aerodynamics to add the world's tallest and fastest looping roller coaster with an unheard of 7 inversions for the 1988 season. But with Great Adventure's current circumstances, it wasn't viable to add such an expensive ride into the failing amusement park. Great Adventure was also looking to save the park's image with families, and the decision was made to introduce a new children's area at the park called Bugs Bunny Land. Great Adventure would also open Condor in 1988, a new flat ride built by Huss. Great Adventure wound up selling the plans for its 1988 mega looping roller coaster to Six Flags Great America in Gurnee, Illinois, as the Six Flags parks operated individually of each other in that time period, something I may highlight in a future video. With the last second switch, Great America constructed the ride in their parking lot, and the ride opened as Shockwave on June 3rd of 1988. Shockwave stood at a height of 170 feet or 52 meters, had a 155 foot or 47 meter first drop, and reached speeds of 65 miles per hour or 105 kilometers per hour, rocketed through 7 inversions, and featured 3,900 feet or 1,189 meters of track. For that time period, the ride was without question absolutely jaw-dropping. Not only was the coaster a giant that dominated the front of the park with its beautiful blue track and white supports, but it featured 7 inversions, defeating the former record holder, Vortex, at Kings Island, which featured 6 inversions. Meanwhile, at Great Adventure, the 1988 season was similar to the 1985 season, where many under-the-hood changes occurred that improved guest safety. Many attractions received new and updated control systems, which required both the ride operator at the main panel and an attendant who checked restraints to both enable an attraction to dispatch. An improved training program for ride operators was also introduced to better ensure the safe operation of attractions. This would help to avoid both the unfortunate accidents that took place in 1987. The park also added permanent metal detectors at the main entrance to screen all guests who entered to help ensure a safer environment. Overall, while Great Adventure had to learn by mistake, the park wound up being a model of how amusement parks should be run going forward. But even with these safety improvements and family-driven focus, attendance in 1988 was still staggeringly low, at only 2.1 million guests, an 8% improvement from 1987, and the park was allegedly on the path to lose its food selling license. To counteract the continuing decline, it was decided to go ahead with adding a record-breaking mega looping roller coaster. On September 29, 1988, Ray Williams announced the park would be adding the Great American Scream Machine, the world's tallest and fastest looping steel roller coaster. The $6.8 million attraction would be the park's single largest investment and would open in the spring of 1989. Standing at a height of 173 feet or 53 meters, riders would be taken down a 155 foot or 47 meter first drop, banked at 55 degrees, and reach speeds of 68 miles per hour or 109 kilometers per hour, race through 7 inversions, and complete a total of 3,800 feet or 1,158 meters of track. The ride would be designed and manufactured by Aerodynamics of Clearfield, Utah, who had also manufactured Lightning Loops, the Runaway Mine Train, and several of the park's other rides. Another beastly statistic of the ride was its capacity. It would run 3 28-passenger trains and would have a total hourly capacity of 1,900 riders per hour. Ron Toomer, president of Aerodynamics and a former NASA engineer, said, "The new Aero coaster to be installed at Six Flags Great Adventure embodies the most up-to-date technology available for control and operation of the ride. Overall, Scream Machine would be a near identical clone of Shockwave at Great America, but stand 3 feet taller and feature a few design tweaks I'll highlight later in the video. The park proceeded to remove its Sarajevo bobsled roller coaster, an Intamin bobsled, which had been installed in Great Adventure's parking lot for the 1984 season. Sarajevo bobsleds had always been a low-capacity attraction, known for its long and slow-moving lines, so removing the attraction made sense. Great Adventure wound up selling the ride to Great America, where it reopened in 1989 as Rolling Thunder, but with higher capacity trains built by Balaguer Mabillard, or B&M. For Great Adventure, selling their bobsleds helped to not only partially pay for Scream Machine, but it also opened additional room for the new ride, as it would be built even further into Great Adventure's parking lot. It was originally planned to use Sarajevo Bobsled Station as a shade structure for Scream Machine's queue, but this idea was later scrapped. Bright red pieces of steel track and white support pieces began to arrive in the parking lot. Great American Scream Machine was originally planned to feature the same name and theme as Ninja at Six Flags Magic Mountain, which had opened in 1988. This would have allowed the ride to use the same logo, merchandise, and advertising, but there were allegedly some sort of issues with crowds drawn to Ninja, so Great Adventure decided on a more generic and patriotic name, Great American Scream Machine. Construction of Scream Machine began in September 1988. With Great Adventure supervising the construction job, the ride was built by Ironworkers Locals 401 and 68, as well as many other union groups from the surrounding area. The ride's white steel support structure was erected high in the air as work crews pieced together the lattice structures and large steel columns. Certain sections of the ride began to sport the bright red steel track atop the supports. Constructing the clothoid vertical loops looked interesting, as they were built without using all necessary supports. The supports holding the bottom of the loops were erected, followed by all of the track of each loop. It wasn't until later that the large white columns that supported the upper section of each loop were added. Construction continued into the winter, and thanks to periods of good weather and efforts made by the park and construction crews, progress continued at a healthy rate. Steel construction of the ride concluded at the end of the ride's second corkscrew, a load of the ground section. The steelworkers said that they rarely finished projects on the ground, making this a rather unique scenario. Unfortunately, the ride wasn't quite ready for the park's opening day on March 24th of 1989, as the final stages of construction were delayed due to massive rainfalls in the early spring. Work to get the ride ready continued all the way up until hours before the ride's media day preview on April 14th, 1989. Crews worked hard to finish landscaping around the ride area, the queue itself, and placing decorative rock stones to cover the former parking lot beneath the ride. Yes, Scream Machine was a parking lot roller coaster just like Scream at Six Flags Magic Mountain. But thankfully, Great Adventure covered up the parking lot pavement. They created bands of red and white with the stones to make the ground underneath the ride look like the ribbons from the American flag when viewed from above. Media Day for the Great American Scream Machine kicked off on Friday, April 14th, 1989, just as planned. The weather for the day was also gorgeous, so the ride really popped against the bright blue sky in the background. Scream Machine even opened as the world's tallest and fastest roller coaster, period, and held that title for just a few weeks until Magnum XL 200 opened at Cedar Point on May 6th that same year. However, Scream Machine would still hold the title as the world's tallest and fastest looping steel roller coaster. Reception of the new Mega Looper was extremely positive, and the ride was highly popular with guests attending the park. Its line would commonly completely fill and flood out into the midway outside the ride. Reviews of the coaster were also very positive.
It's fast, it's smooth, it's exciting.
Would you do it again?
I can't wait to get back in line.
Never lets up. There's not a dead spot on the whole thing. That's a great first hill. Have you been on it?
The ride had 3 trains, one colored red, one colored white, and one colored blue. Red was called Freedom, white was called Liberty, and blue was called Spirit. These names were written on each train. The ride began with a boost out of the station rather quickly with the use of tire drives into a straightaway, which led into a small dip into a sharp left curve. Trains then climbed the 173-foot lift hill as riders were offered a view of the park and surroundings. The train would reach the crest of the lift, where they would bank left and descend the 155-foot first drop, banked at 55 degrees. Riders reached 68 miles per hour at the bottom of the drop, and then began to climb into the ride's first vertical loop at a height of 136 feet. The train would exit the first loop and bank to the left as riders were taken through a wide and descending left-hand curve. The track would unbank and riders were slammed with back-to-back vertical loops, delivering a high number of positive G-forces. The first loop was 107 feet tall, and the second 97 feet tall. The ride would then ascend through a sharp left turn, delivering a high amount of laterals and airtime, especially to riders seated in the front cars. The train would then come to a near stop in the mid-course brake run. Slowly, it would exit the mid-course and descend a zigzag drop into a boomerang, consisting of 2 inversions. The first half was very slow, which offered riders a good amount of hang time. Riders would exit the boomerang as they banked right, leading into a right curve as the train banked further into 2 corkscrews taken back to back. Next was a gentle hill that zigzagged to the right, followed by a climb and gradual left-hand curve into the ride's final brake run, ending the ride. I still remember my rides on Scream Machine pretty vividly. The first half, leading up to the mid-course brake run, was taken rapidly and boasted a high number of positive G-forces, especially at the top of each vertical loop. It was really intense, while the second half was slow and much more like a smaller aero looper. There was always really great hang time in the boomerang. The Great American Scream Machine would help the park's performance substantially. In August of 1989, Anita Rother, the park's public relations manager, told the media that Scream Machine had boosted the park's attendance by 20% over their 1988 numbers, which is extremely impressive. Reviews of the ride continued to stay positive. Children would come off the ride, telling those who didn't ride, "You missed the best ride in the world." The ride's high capacity was also perfect for Great Adventure, which at the time attracted an average of 25,000 guests a day. As the season continued, the popularity of the park was met with a renewed guest confidence in the establishment, something the park was working hard to achieve. The 1989 season would see an attendance of 2.4 million guests, up 14% from 1988, and attendance would continue to climb year after year until the park hit 4 million guests in 1995. Now, while things were looking much better for Great Adventure, this didn't mean that Scream Machine was absent of any problems or issues. At the time, Arrow still designed and manufactured their roller coasters primarily by hand, and were slow to adopt the use of computers for designing and manufacturing their track. As computer technology advanced, Arrow still stuck with the same methods they had pioneered during the 1970s when it came to building looping roller coasters. Because of that, Arrow did not custom design the different inversions used on their coasters, but simply reused the same inversion designs copy and paste style. All clothoid vertical loops were identical, all boomerangs were identical, and all corkscrews were identical. When Arrow started building looping roller coasters in the 1970s, reusing elements wasn't an issue as their roller coasters were smaller in height. At slower speeds and smaller heights, Arrow were able to accurately predict the speed trains would take inversions, and the impacts of inaccuracies and quirks from their engineering process weren't as noticeable. That's part of the reason that many smaller Arrow looping coasters are still in operation to this day. But what you'll hear next is why Arrow's mega looping roller coasters have become a dying breed. As the amusement industry pushed into the 1980s, parks wanted bigger, faster, and longer roller coasters, especially when it came to looping roller coasters. Arrow was slow to adopt new engineering practices and computer software to aid their design process. Allegedly, Ron Toomer did not want to change the way the company made coasters, as Arrow was the largest steel coaster manufacturer of the time, and doing so would cost a lot of money, take a lot of time, and create a large amount of risk. Even while his engineering team told him that this should be done, as the inaccuracies and quirks of their design and engineering process would begin to show more heavily as the coasters grew larger. And keep in mind, other manufacturers were showing signs of relying more on computer when it came to design and manufacturing coasters, like Shockwave at Six Flags Magic Mountain, which opened in 1986. 3 years ahead of Scream Machine. Scream Machine was built with Arrow's same copy and paste inversions, the same inversions you'd find on a much smaller Arrow looper like Viper at Six Flags Darien Lake. To account for higher speeds, Arrow simply took the vertical loops of Scream Machine and elevated them higher in the air. Each of the 3 loops were the same, but sat at different heights off the ground, with each successive loop getting closer to ground level to account for speed loss. While this design method may have seemed fine to Arrow, they were unable to accurately predict the speed trains would travel the course. Scream Machine traveled far too fast through the first 3 loops and the turn into the mid-course brake run. This exerted higher than anticipated G-forces on riders, and the mid-course brake run needed to slow trains to a crawl for the second half of the ride. This also exerted far too many forces on the ride's structure. Scream Machine featured Arrow's traditional track design, where the rails connected to the larger strongback tube with the use of track ties, which were each 3 pieces of steel welded together. The forces from the rails were distributed to the strongback through all the welds, which could cause some issues. With Scream Machine running too fast through its vertical loops, it began to create issues with the welds and the track ties. Great Adventure would have to do a considerable amount of track maintenance to properly inspect and reinforce the welds. And this issue wasn't just present on Scream Machine, but also Shockwave at Great America and Viper at Six Flags Magic Mountain, the last of the 3 Six Flags Arrow Mega Loopers. Problems like this are a direct example of the inaccuracies and quirks that affect Arrow's coasters because of their primitive design and engineering process. After Great Adventure closed for the 1992 season, Arrow removed the regular track at the top of each vertical loop and installed new pieces that included additional structural bracing. These track pieces were much stronger and were better suited to handle the high forces that Scream Machine exerted, thus making each loop require less maintenance. A set of trim brakes were also added at the exit of the first vertical loop to help slow trains into the following 2 loops and climb into the mid-course brake run. Scream Machine wasn't the only ride to receive these modifications, as Shockwave at Great America and Viper at Magic Mountain also received the same reinforced track pieces and trim brakes. You can still find some of Scream Machine's original track from the top of the loop in Great Adventures Drive-Thru Safari during the Monkey exhibit. On some of Arrow's newer roller coasters, like Desperado at Buffalo Bills, the company introduced a new track tie that consisted of a single piece of steel, rather than 3 pieces of steel welded together. This meant there were less welds to maintain, and the forces from the ride's rails were better transferred to the strong back, as they traversed through a single piece of steel rather than various pieces of steel and welds. Scream Machine, Shockwave, and Viper all would have benefited from this new track design, had Arrow gone through with updating their design and engineering process. But again, Arrow were slow to adopt new building practices even as their coasters grew massively in size. Now, while the addition of trim brakes and reinforced track may have helped alleviate the ride's structural problems, the ride still faced another major issue. It was rough. The ride became infamous for bashing riders' heads side to side during its awkward and janky transitions. Taller riders would bash their necks side to side against the restraints, and shorter riders would bang their heads. I remember some of the ride's roughest moments were the transition into the turn after the first vertical loop, and then the transition out of the turn into the double loop was even worse. The ride continued with its rough experience during the second half. The boomerang was always extremely awkward, and the transition into the first corkscrew was awful, just like it is on any Arrow looping coaster, as they were all the same. The most jarring transition on the ride, however, was easily the sharp curve into the mid-course brake run, which never seemed banked enough. As a coaster enthusiast, I actually loved this transition, but it was intense, exerting a high number of laterals and then ejector airtime as the train hopped into the mid-course brake run, especially for riders in the front cars. It's scary to think that this transition was even worse on Shockwave at Great America. Shockwave featured an even tighter turn into the mid-course, and the track unbanked far earlier, as Arrow thought trains would run through this section of the coaster much slower. For Scream Machine, Great Adventure asked Arrow to widen the curve, so the company altered the double loop on Scream Machine, making the loops exit to the right instead of exiting to the left like on Shockwave. This helped open additional room for that turn into the mid-course without altering the ride's layout. Compared to Shockwave, Scream Machine also featured a smoother transition out of its first drop with better banking. And the transition from the first vertical loop into the left-hand curve was improved also. On Shockwave, there was a small bunny hop as the train banked left and into the curve. This element was probably fun for enthusiasts, but rough and jarring for everyone else. For Scream Machine, Arrow flattened the bunny hill out of the first loop, and the track exited the loop at a downward slope that matched the high-speed curve following. It gets even crazier when you realize that Great America either never finished installing the trims, or completely removed the trims out of the first loop, meaning Shockwave still ran at full pace, so it had to run considerably rougher than Scream Machine. Apparently, Shockwave's more primitive ride computer couldn't properly account for the addition of trim brakes, leading to many breakdowns. It makes sense why Shockwave only lasted at Great America until 2002. It's even crazier to think that if Great Adventure had gotten the Mega Looper in 1988 as originally planned, it would have been Shockwave's more problematic design with the rougher transitions. Now, a big reason why Scream Machine and Shockwave were so rough was because they didn't feature proper heartlining. Heartlining is where the track of a roller coaster wraps around riders, so that a rider's heart remains in the same place while banking into or out of a curve. This helps reduce lateral forces and keeps your body from slamming side to side, especially your upper body and head. Newer roller coasters use this design tactic and deliver much smoother experiences, where Scream Machine did not. The tops of Scream Machine's loops are also far too tight, as they were simply round circles. So as the train transitioned from the wider radius of the lower loop into the tight radius at the top, your head was basically slammed forward. It was a very forceful moment. Another thing that didn't help Scream Machine's case were the new roller coasters that started opening shortly after the ride was introduced, mainly the roller coasters built by B&M. B&M roared into the 1990s, introducing smooth and state-of-the-art steel roller coasters that were computer designed and manufactured. In 1993, Great Adventure opened Batman the Ride, an inverted roller coaster built by B&M, where riders rode beneath the tracks as they flipped and whipped through different inversions. Batman was glass smooth and much more state-of-the-art than Scream Machine. At heart, Scream Machine was simply an Arrow looping coaster from the 70s but scaled up. With Batman now setting the benchmark for roller coaster smoothness and innovation, guests attending Great Adventure were given a new perspective at just how rough Scream Machine truly was. The situation would only worsen as Scream Machine not only grew rougher, but additional roller coasters opened at the park that were also glass smooth, such as Medusa. Great Adventure opened Medusa in 1999 as the world's first floorless roller coaster. It was another B&M and essentially the same concept as Scream Machine, a 7 inverting looping steel coaster, but Medusa executed the concept much more gracefully and with custom designed elements. Now, aside from being a rough and quickly outdated roller coaster, the Great American Scream Machine was actually one of the safest roller coasters at the park, and could churn through a large number of riders each hour. Scream Machine featured dual redundant shoulder harness restraints, along with a safety monitoring system that required all harnesses to be closed in a downward position before the train could dispatch. On top of that, the ride also featured a dual redundant and interactive programmable logic controller, or PLC, that controlled and monitored the ride's safety system. You can think of the PLC as the ride's computer. The PLC managed many things, including the ride's block zone system. For those of you who are unfamiliar, a block zone is a section of ride that only one train may occupy. At the end of a block zone is a method to stop a train in case the block zone ahead is still occupied. This is the safety system that prevents roller coaster trains from colliding into one another. Aerodynamics did their block zones differently than most roller coaster manufacturers. The block zones of Scream Machine in its later years were as follows: A block, which ran from the base of the lift hill to the top; B block, which ran from the top of the lift hill until the end of the ride's mid-course brake run; and C block, which ran from the end of the mid-course brake run until the end of the ride's first hold brake on the final brake run. So technically just 3 block zones, but the ride also had another hold position before the station called the ready brakes in the station itself. So while you might think these areas are normal block zones, the ride did not categorize them as such. This was something typical of aerodynamics. When the ride was announced in 1988, Aero claimed the ride was capable of pumping through approximately 1,900 riders per hour. With 3 28-passenger trains, this would have required at least 68 dispatches per hour, totaling 1,904 riders per hour. At 68 cycles per hour, that means a train needed to dispatch from the station roughly every 53 seconds. At that rate, a train would need to dispatch from the station before the train ahead detached from the lift hill and went down the first drop like so. So technically before the train ahead cleared A block. Going back to the block zone diagram, I believe the original block zone Scream Machine opened with looked more like this, with the only difference being A block. In this setup, A block ends toward the bottom of the lift hill, and the center of the lift pictured in gray was not considered a block zone. A block would basically end at the height that trains would roll up the lift before running out of speed and catching the chain lift. This means 2 trains could theoretically be on the lift hill at the same time, although at a 53-second interval, the train ahead would always drop off the lift hill as the next one rolled into the lift. But at some point, I believe the ride's programming may have been changed to turn all of the lift hill into A block, like how more modern roller coasters are programmed. Scream Machine also featured multi-move, where the train dispatching from the station and the train parked in ready brakes could both advance forward at the same time. Both trains were controlled by tire drives and were quickly advanced forward, which helped limit the amount of idle time where a train was not parked in the station. I believe over the years, Scream Machine's true theoretical capacity became 1,680 riders per hour, partially because the lift hill was turned into one block zone, but also because of the mid-course brake run. In later years, the mid-course began slowing trains closer and closer to a stop, lengthening the amount of time it took trains to complete C block, the section of track after the mid-course block. Combine that with the 53-second dispatch interval, the next train cresting the lift into B block could possibly reach the mid-course before the train ahead completed C block, forcing it to set up on the mid-course brake run and stop, because C block was still not clear. So I believe the dispatch interval was lengthened to 60 seconds to help avoid that, leading to 60 cycles an hour and a lower hourly capacity of 1,680 riders, which is still really good. A 60-second dispatch interval also allows the train ahead to clear the lift hill before the next train dispatches, which is more evidence that A block became the entire lift hill. And before Scream Machine was built, Aerodynamics attempted something even crazier with Shockwave at Six Flags Great America. Aero built and programmed Shockwave to handle up to 4 train operations with the same track layout and block zones of Scream Machine. To do so, Shockwave featured the original block zone setup of Scream Machine, which allowed 2 trains to be on the lift hill at the same time, and 2 trains would indeed be on the lift hill simultaneously. I don't know the exact amount of time, but I hear trains can be dispatched every 40 seconds or so. Basically, the minimum amount of time required for B block and C block to clear during each cycle. At a 40-second interval, the ride could dispatch 90 trains an hour, leading to a theoretical capacity of 2,520 riders per hour. But because the ride had the same block setup as Scream Machine, it meant that only 2 trains could stack on the final brake run. So with 1 train in the station and 2 on the final brake run, if a holdup occurred in the station, the 4th train would be forced to stop on the mid-course brake run halfway through the ride. This is called setting up or cascading, and I'm sure the ride was programmed so that if the ride did stop on the mid-course, a ride attendant would actually have to walk up the steps to the mid-course and then manually restart the train. This would have forced the ride crew to stick to very short dispatch times, most likely no longer than a minute or so. Shockwave was delivered with 4 trains, but before the ride opened, it was decided to only run 3 trains at most, as it just wasn't worth the trouble of trying to run the ride so quickly with 4. It was also determined that the monstrous capacity of 4 trains wasn't really needed either, and the ride could still do impressive numbers with just 3 trains. As a result, Great American Scream Machine was shipped to Great Adventure with the intent to run 3 trains right from the start. The years would continue on for Scream Machine, and the ride ran quite reliably. With its new track pieces on the vertical loops, the ride was pretty structurally sound and held together very well. Every time I attended Great Adventure between 2000 and 2010, Scream Machine was always open. However, the ride remained rough, and with Great Adventure introducing new and state-of-the-art roller coasters every year, Scream Machine's popularity dropped further and further. I remember waiting in long lines all over the park and Scream Machine being a walk-on most days. Part of that was also due to the ride's high capacity. The ride still churned through riders and would actually beat Superman Ultimate Flight, a very popular roller coaster at Great Adventure, in ridership every year because it simply operated at a higher capacity. In 2005, the ride received a fresh coat of paint, and in my head, I didn't think the ride was going anywhere. In 2010, rumors began circulating that the ride would be removed, and on July 5th of that year, the park confirmed the ride's removal. The ride's last day of operation was July 18th, 2010, and shortly after that, the park began to dismantle the ride to make room for a new attraction. On September 10th of that year, the park announced it would be opening Green Lantern in 2011. The ride would come from Six Flags Kentucky Kingdom, where it operated as Chang since 1997, and reopened at Great Adventure as a relocated attraction. Green Lantern opened in 2011 and still stands in the same plot of land previously home to Scream Machine. Ironically, the ride is also rather rough and commonly gives a good dose of headbanging to riders. So while Great American Scream Machine did what it needed to and helped save Great Adventure during the late 1980s, the ride itself was quite primitive from a design and engineering perspective. It was too big for itself and led to a rather rough experience for riders. But thanks to the success the ride brought Great Adventure, the park was able to regain its positive image in the eyes of families and others who attended the park. Guests came surging back into Great Adventure, and with that, the park was able to afford much better and innovative roller coasters than Scream Machine, that quickly made the ride outdated. So it does make sense that Scream Machine was ultimately removed to make way for other rides, but man was it a classic. I'd personally love if the ride were still in operation today at Great Adventure, as I'm a big Arrow Looper fan and it was intense. But I think most of the general public would prefer Green Lantern, even if that ride's not the most comfortable either. So that'll conclude this video on the Great American Scream Machine, the problematic roller coaster that saved Six Flags Great Adventure. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button and leave a comment, as that really helps the channel against the YouTube algorithm. Also, be sure to check out our merch store on Teespring, where you can pick up some Block Zone merchandise. Alright, thanks for watching everyone. Peace.